Montana Territory, 1872. The wind howled across the open plains like a wounded animal, carrying with it the promise of the season's first snow. Isaac Young pulled his hat lower against the biting chill, watching as his breath clouded before him in the fading light. At 26, he'd already spent 8 hard years on the frontier, and those years had taught him one undeniable truth. The West was no place for tenderness. Out here, a man survived by keeping his heart as hard as the frozen ground beneath his horse's hooves. "Going to be a cold one tonight," muttered Frank, the weathered trail boss who'd hired Isaac 3 months prior. "You sure you want to ride into Sweetwater this evening? Storm's coming fast." Isaac nodded, his jaw set in determination. "Got business that can't wait. I'll be back by morning." Frank didn't press further. That was the way of things out here. Men kept their reasons to themselves and others respected the silence. Isaac preferred it that way. The less people knew about you, the less they could use against you when times got hard. And in his experience, times always got hard eventually. As he mounted his dappled gray stallion, Silver, Isaac checked his revolver and adjusted his coat. 8 years ago, he'd ridden west with dreams of adventure, fortune, and perhaps even companionship. Now he knew better. The frontier was a place of survival, not connection. Every time he'd lowered his guard, with fellow cowboys, with townsfolk, with women, he'd been reminded painfully of his naivety. His brother's death in a saloon brawl 3 years prior had sealed that lesson in blood. "A man stands alone out here," he whispered to Silver as they set off toward town. "That's how we stay alive." The setting sun painted the horizon in brilliant oranges and reds as Isaac rode, casting long shadows across the vast emptiness. By the time the distant lights of Sweetwater came into view, darkness had fallen completely, and the first fat snowflakes had begun to drift from the heavens. Sweetwater was typical of frontier towns that had sprung up to service the cattle trails and nearby mining operations. One main street lined with false-fronted buildings, a handful of saloons doing brisk business, and the occasional respectable establishment trying to bring civilization to the wilderness. Isaac rarely came to town except for supplies or to deposit his earnings at the bank. Tonight, however, he needed to send a telegram to the ranch owner's son about a change in the cattle drive schedule. As he dismounted in front of the telegraph office, he noticed it was already closed for the evening. Cursing under his breath, Isaac tied Silver to the hitching post and turned toward the Frontier Hotel. He'd have to stay the night now and send the telegram in the morning. That's when he saw her. She stood on the boardwalk outside the stagecoach office, clutching a small valise and looking up at the building's darkened windows with an expression of dismay. Her honey-blonde hair was partially visible beneath a fashionable but impractical hat, and her traveling dress, while well-made, offered little protection against the increasing snowfall. She couldn't have been more than 20 years old. Isaac's first instinct was to keep walking. Whatever predicament the young woman found herself in was none of his concern. The frontier was unforgiving to the unprepared, and she clearly hadn't expected snow in October. Yet something about the defeated slump of her shoulders made him pause. "Stage office is closed, ma'am," he said, his voice gruffer than intended. "Won't open again until morning." The young woman turned, startled by his voice. Up close, Isaac could see her face clearly, high cheekbones, delicate nose, and eyes the deep green of pine forests. Those eyes widened as she took in his appearance. "I see that now," she replied, her voice steady despite the slight trembling of her lips from the cold. "I was supposed to meet someone, but it seems my stage arrived later than expected." "Town's mostly closed up except for the saloons," Isaac said, gesturing down the street. "Hotel's still open, though." She nodded, then looked down at her valise. "Thank you for the information." Isaac should have tipped his hat and continued on his way. That would have been the sensible thing to do. But as she stood there, a snowflake landing on her eyelash, he noticed the way she suppressed a shiver, trying to maintain her dignity. Before he could reconsider, he was unbuttoning his heavy wool coat. "Take this," he said, holding it out to her. "Night's only getting colder." She looked at him with surprise. "I couldn't possibly." "I've got my vest and shirt. You're shaking like an aspen leaf." He held the coat closer. "Take it." "I'm headed to the hotel anyway." After a moment's hesitation, she reached for the coat. "That's very kind of you, Mr. Young, Isaac Young." "Thank you, Mr. Young." She slipped into the coat, which enveloped her smaller frame entirely. "I'm Beatrice Fletcher, recently of Boston, Massachusetts." Isaac raised an eyebrow. You're a long way from Boston. Yes, she agreed, a shadow crossing her face. I am. They walked together toward the hotel, the snow falling more heavily now. Isaac found himself curious about what would bring a Boston woman to a Montana Territory cattle town, but he didn't ask. Questions led to conversation, conversation led to connection, and connection led to disappointment. Better to deliver her safely to the hotel and be on his way. The Frontier Hotel's lobby was warm and reasonably clean, illuminated by several oil lamps. The proprietor, Mrs. Winters, looked up from her ledger as they entered, her eyes darting curiously between Isaac and Beatrice. Evening, Mrs. Winters, Isaac said. The lady needs a room for the night. Mrs. Winters' expression turned apologetic. I'm sorry, dears, but we've only got one room left. The mining company has taken most of them for their surveyors. Isaac frowned. I need a room as well. As I said, just the one left. The older woman's eyes twinkled with something that made Isaac uncomfortable. Unless you two are. We are not, Beatrice said quickly, her cheeks coloring. We've only just met. Mrs. Winters shrugged. Well then, I suppose one of you can take the room, and the other can try the saloon. Sometimes they let rooms upstairs, though I wouldn't recommend it for a lady. Isaac looked at Beatrice, who was still wrapped in his coat, her face showing a mixture of determination and uncertainty. Take the room, he said. I'll find somewhere else. Beatrice bit her lip. That hardly seems fair, Mr. Young. You were here first, and you've already given me your coat. Which you can return tomorrow, he replied. A lady shouldn't be walking around the saloons looking for lodging. For a moment she looked as though she might argue. Instead, she opened her reticule and withdrew her coin purse. At least let me pay for your trouble. Isaac stepped back as if she'd offered him a venomous snake. I don't need your money, Miss Fletcher. I didn't mean to offend, she said quickly. I only wished to. The room is $1 for the night, Mrs. Winters interrupted, clearly sensing the tension. Beatrice handed over the money and received a key in return. She turned back to Isaac, still wearing his coat. I insist on returning this to you tomorrow, Mr. Young. Where might I find you? I'll be at the telegraph office in the morning. After that, I'm riding back to the Triple R. She nodded. Thank you again for your kindness. As he watched her ascend the stairs, Isaac felt an unwelcome warmth in his chest. He tamped it down ruthlessly. 8 years on the frontier had taught him that kindness was often repaid with treachery, and trust was a luxury he couldn't afford. Whatever Miss Beatrice Fletcher's story was, it wouldn't intersect with his beyond tomorrow morning. With a curt nod to Mrs. Winters, Isaac stepped back into the snowy night to find alternative lodging, trying to ignore the lingering scent of lavender that had drifted from Beatrice's hair. The snow fell steadily through the night, blanketing Sweetwater in white. By morning, nearly 8 inches covered the ground, transforming the muddy Main Street into a pristine wonderland. Isaac had spent an uncomfortable night in the livery stable, paying the stable boy 50 cents to bed down in the hay loft. It wasn't the first time he'd slept rough, and he doubted it would be the last. After checking on Silver, Isaac made his way to the telegraph office, which had just opened for the day. The operator, a thin man with spectacles perched on his nose, took Isaac's message with efficient indifference. With that business concluded, Isaac found himself at loose ends. The logical thing would be to collect his coat and start the journey back to the Triple R, but the depth of the snow gave him pause. Traveling would be slow, and there was no urgent need to return immediately. He was deliberating over breakfast at the town's small cafe when the bell above the door jingled. Beatrice Fletcher stepped inside, her honey-blonde hair now neatly arranged beneath a modest bonnet. She wore his coat over her dress, the sleeves rolled up several times to free her hands. Her eyes scanned the room before landing on him, and a smile brightened her face. Isaac felt a traitor flutter in his chest as she approached his table. "Good morning, Mr. Young," she said. "I hoped I might find you here." He stood, remembering the manners his mother had instilled in him long ago. "Miss Fletcher, I trust you slept well." "Better than you, I imagine," she replied, a knowing look in her eyes. "Mrs. Winters mentioned you might have stayed in the livery." Isaac gestured to the chair opposite him. "Would you care to join me?" "I'm about to order breakfast." She hesitated only briefly before sitting down. "Thank you, I would like that." As they waited for their food, an awkward silence settled between them. Isaac was unaccustomed to making conversation, particularly with refined young women from Boston. Finally, he cleared his throat. "What brings you to Sweetwater, Miss Fletcher?" "It's not exactly a common destination for Eastern ladies." Beatrice's fingers toyed with the edge of the tablecloth. "I'm to be the new schoolteacher. The town council wrote to a teaching college in Boston, and I accepted the position." Isaac couldn't hide his surprise. Schoolteacher, Sweetwater barely has enough children for a school. The letter mentioned 12 students currently, with more expected as families settle in the area. Her chin lifted slightly. "It may be small, but every child deserves an education, Mr. Young." There was a determination in her voice that caught Isaac's attention. She was either remarkably naive or remarkably brave to travel alone to the Montana Territory for such a position. "And who were you meant to meet last night?" he asked. "Mr. Hollister, the council chairman. He was supposed to show me to my accommodations." She sighed. "I imagine the snow prevented him from meeting the stage." Their breakfast arrived, hot coffee, eggs, and biscuits with gravy. Isaac watched as Beatrice took a cautious bite of the biscuit, her expression warming with appreciation. "This is quite good," she said. "Different from what I'm accustomed to, but delicious. Frontier cooking isn't fancy, but it keeps a body going." Isaac took a long swallow of his coffee. "So you're planning to stay in Sweetwater permanently?" "For the foreseeable future, yes." She met his gaze steadily. "I came west for a purpose, Mr. Young, and I intend to fulfill it." There was something in her tone, a hint of steel beneath the refined exterior, that made Isaac reassess his initial impression of her as simply another unprepared Easterner. Before he could respond, the cafe door opened again, admitting a portly man in his 50s, red-faced from exertion. "Miss Fletcher," the man called, looking around the room. Beatrice raised her hand. "Mr. Hollister, I presume." The man hurried over, removing his hat. "My deepest apologies, Miss Fletcher. The snow, we didn't expect the stage usually." "It's quite all right," Beatrice assured him. "Mr. Young here was kind enough to assist me." Hollister turned to Isaac, his expression shifting subtly. "Young, from the Triple R." Isaac nodded. "Well, thank you for looking after our new schoolteacher." Hollister's tone was cordial but carried an undercurrent of dismissal. Isaac understood immediately. Cowboys weren't considered suitable company for schoolteachers, especially those from Boston. "I was just leaving," Isaac said, standing and placing money on the table for both breakfasts. "Miss Fletcher was returning my coat." "Oh," Beatrice began to remove the garment, but Isaac shook his head. "Keep it for now. It's still snowing, and I've got my sheepskin in my saddlebags." She hesitated. "But how will I return it to you?" "The Triple R is just 15 miles north. You can send it out when the weather clears." He tipped his hat to her. "Good luck with your students, Miss Fletcher." Without waiting for response, Isaac nodded to Hollister and strode out of the cafe. The cold air hit him immediately, but he welcomed it. It cleared his head of lavender scent and green eyes that reminded him of spring. As he untied Silver from the hitching post where he'd left him, Isaac heard the cafe door open behind him. "Mr. Young." He turned to see Beatrice hurrying toward him, still wearing his coat. Her cheeks were pink from the cold, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "You forgot this," she said, holding out a folded paper. Isaac took it, confused. "What's this?" "A receipt," she said, "for your coat. So you can be sure I'll return it." The gesture was so unexpected that Isaac found himself speechless. She'd written out an actual receipt on a piece of notepaper. One wool coat, borrowed from Mr. Isaac Young, to be returned within 1 week's time. Signed, Beatrice Fletcher. "That's not necessary," he finally managed. "Perhaps not, but I believe in keeping my word. And this gives me a proper reason to see you again." Her eyes met his with surprising directness. "Unless you prefer I send it with someone else." Isaac should have said yes. That would have been the sensible response. Instead, he found himself saying, "No, I'd be happy to collect it myself when I'm next in town." Her smile was like sunshine breaking through clouds. "Then I'll look forward to it. Goodbye, Mr. Young." As she turned and walked back to where Hollister waited, Isaac carefully folded the receipt and tucked it into his shirt pocket. The paper seemed to burn against his chest, a dangerous reminder that some walls were more easily breached than others. With a click of his tongue, he mounted Silver and pointed the horse northward, toward the triple R and away from green eyes and honey-blonde hair. Yet even as the town receded behind him, Isaac found himself counting the days until his coat would need retrieving. The Triple R Ranch was a sprawling operation that ran nearly 5,000 head of cattle across 30,000 acres of Montana grassland. Isaac had worked there for almost 2 years now, longer than he'd stayed anywhere since his brother's death. The owner, Ronald Rutherford, was a fair man who paid well and asked few questions about a man's past. When Isaac returned, he found the bunkhouse abuzz with activity. The unexpected snowstorm had caused problems with some of the herd, and several cowboys were preparing to ride out to the north pasture where a few hundred cattle had scattered. Young called out Jeb Tucker, the ranch foreman. "Thought you'd be back yesterday." "Got caught in the snow," Isaac replied, unsaddling Silver. "What needs doing?" "We're short-handed. Palmer's down with a broken arm and Rodriguez has fever. Need you to ride out with Wilson to check the line shack by Elk Creek. Make sure the roof held in the snow." Isaac nodded, grateful for the assignment. Hard work would keep his mind occupied and away from thoughts of schoolteachers with honey-blonde hair. Within the hour, he and Wilson, a taciturn cowboy from Texas, were riding east toward Elk Creek. The line shack stood sturdy against the elements, its roof sagging slightly under the weight of snow but otherwise intact. After clearing the worst of it and repairing a loose shutter, the men settled in for the night, as darkness came early and the temperature was dropping rapidly. Wilson busied himself with making coffee on the small stove, while Isaac arranged their bedrolls. "Heard you spent the night in town," Wilson said, breaking his usual silence. "Anything interesting happening in Sweetwater?" Isaac shrugged. "Not much. New schoolteacher arrived on the stage." "Schoolteacher," Wilson's eyebrows rose. "Man or woman?" "Woman from Boston." Wilson gave a low whistle. "Eastern lady, eh? Pretty." Isaac concentrated on adjusting his bedroll, didn't notice. Wilson's tone was skeptical. "That why you're not wearing your good coat?" "The one you wouldn't even lend me when I was freezing my backside off last winter." Isaac shot him a warning look. "Lost it in a poker game." "You don't play poker." "I started." Wilson laughed and let the subject drop, but Isaac could feel the man's curious eyes on him for the rest of the evening. It was unusual for Isaac to engage with townsfolk, and everyone at the Triple R knew it. He kept to himself, did his job well, and avoided entanglements. That was his reputation, and it had served him well. Yet as he lay in his bedroll that night, listening to Wilson's gentle snoring, Isaac found himself wondering what Beatrice Fletcher thought of her new home. Was she disappointed by Sweetwater's rough-hewn buildings and muddy streets? Did she regret coming west, and why had a clearly educated, refined young woman chosen to leave Boston for the Montana Territory in the first place? These questions followed Isaac through the next several days as he went about his duties at the ranch. The snow began to melt, turning the ground to mud but making travel easier. By the week's end, Isaac found himself volunteering to make the supply run to Sweetwater, something he'd never done before. "You feeling all right, young?" Rutherford asked when Isaac offered. "Thought you hated town runs." "Just restless," Isaac replied, "and I need to pick up something I left there." The rancher studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Take the wagon then. We need flour, coffee, and ammunition. Jeb has the full list." The journey to town took longer with the wagon, but by mid-afternoon, Isaac was driving down Sweetwater's main street. The snow was almost gone now, leaving behind puddles and mud. He completed the supply purchases efficiently, loading the wagon with provisions for the ranch. Only when everything was secured did Isaac allow himself to walk toward the small building that served as Sweetwater's schoolhouse. It sat at the edge of town, a simple clapboard structure with a bell tower. As he approached, the door opened, and a stream of children emerged, talking excitedly amongst themselves. Beatrice Fletcher stood in the doorway, watching them go with a fond expression. She wore a simple blue dress with a white collar, her honey-blonde hair pulled back in a practical but becoming style. When she spotted Isaac, her face brightened with recognition. "Mr. Young," she called, stepping out onto the schoolhouse steps. "What a pleasant surprise." Isaac removed his hat, suddenly conscious of his mud-splattered clothes and the 3-day growth of stubble on his jaw. "Miss Fletcher. I was in town for supplies and thought I'd inquire about my coat." Of course, she gestured for him to follow her inside. I have it here, cleaned and folded. The schoolroom was neat and orderly, with rows of desks facing a larger desk and blackboard. Maps hung on the walls along with carefully written alphabet charts. Isaac's coat lay across her desk chair, looking cleaner than it had in years. You didn't need to wash it, he said, picking it up. It seemed the least I could do after your kindness. Beatrice moved to her desk, organizing papers. How are things at your ranch? Not my ranch, Isaac corrected. I just work there. But things are fine. An awkward silence fell between them. Isaac knew he should thank her, take his coat, and leave. Instead, he found himself asking, "How are you finding Sweetwater?" Beatrice's expression brightened. "The children are wonderful, eager to learn and full of questions. The town has been welcoming, though I'm still adjusting to certain frontier realities." Such as? Well, she laughed lightly, the lack of certain amenities I took for granted in Boston. Hot running water, for instance, and books. I've read through my entire collection twice already. The general store might order some for you, Isaac suggested. Mr. Peterson has already promised to include books in his next order. She smiled. I'm adapting, Mr. Young. That's what we humans do best, isn't it? There was something in her tone, a determined optimism that seemed at odds with the challenges she must be facing. Isaac found himself curious despite his better judgment. And your accommodations, did Hollister get you settled? Yes, I have a room at the widow Cooper's house. It's small but comfortable. She tilted her head, studying him. You know, you're the first person to ask how I'm adjusting without immediately suggesting I'll be leaving soon or questioning my ability to endure frontier life. Isaac shifted uncomfortably under her perceptive gaze. Some people underestimate Eastern folk. And you don't. I was Eastern folk once, Ohio, came west when I was 18. Her eyes widened with interest. What brought you to Montana? Isaac hesitated. He rarely spoke of his past, but something about Beatrice Fletcher made him want to answer truthfully. My brother and I came looking for opportunity. He heard about the gold strikes and I followed. Never found gold, but we found work on ranches. Your brother is also at the R. A familiar pain twisted in Isaac's chest. He's dead, 3 years now. Beatrice's expression softened with genuine sympathy. I'm sorry for your loss, Mr. Young. The sincerity in her voice made it difficult to maintain his usual distance. Isaac cleared his throat and changed the subject. Town's hosting a social next Saturday. For the harvest. Yes, I've been enlisted to help with decorations. She smiled. Will you attend? Isaac hadn't planned to. He never attended town socials. But standing in the neat schoolroom, facing Beatrice's expectant gaze, he found himself saying, might do. Her smile widened. I hope you will. I'd welcome a familiar face among the crowd. The clock on the wall chimed 4, breaking the moment. Isaac put on his hat. I should go. Ranch supplies won't deliver themselves. Of course, she walked him to the door. Thank you for coming by, Mr. Young. At the threshold, Isaac paused. Isaac, he said, my friends call me Isaac. A soft flush colored her cheeks. Then I hope you'll call me Beatrice. He nodded, unable to articulate the strange feeling in his chest. With a tip of his hat, he left the schoolhouse, his coat draped over his arm despite the mild afternoon. As he drove the supply wagon back to the R, Isaac tried to make sense of his reactions to Beatrice Fletcher. She was undeniably beautiful, but he'd encountered beautiful women before without this unsettling awareness. Perhaps it was her straightforward manner, so different from the coy approaches of saloon girls or the suspicious glances of ranchers' daughters. Or perhaps it was the way she looked at him, as if she saw beyond the rough exterior to something worth knowing. It had been a long time since anyone had looked at Isaac that way. By the time he reached the R, Isaac had convinced himself that his interest was merely curiosity about an unusual newcomer to the area. Nothing more. The harvest social was out of the question. Such gatherings were for courting couples and families, not solitary cowboys with painful pasts. Yet the following Saturday evening found Isaac freshly shaven, wearing his best shirt and string tie, riding Silver toward Sweetwater. He told himself he was simply curious to see how Beatrice was adapting to frontier life. It wasn't as if he was calling on her or indicating any particular interest. He would make a brief appearance, perhaps exchange a few polite words and leave early. No harm in that. The town hall was decorated with autumn leaves and harvest bounty, pumpkins, corn stalks, and wheat sheaves arranged artfully around the room. Lanterns cast a warm glow over the assembled townsfolk, who chatted in groups while a small band tuned their instruments in the corner. Isaac lingered near the entrance, feeling immediately out of place among the families and townspeople. He was about to turn and leave when he heard his name. "Isaac, you came." Beatrice approached, wearing a dress of deep green that matched her eyes perfectly. Her honey-blonde hair was arranged in an elegant style with a few curls framing her face. She looked, Isaac thought, with a sudden dry mouth, like spring in the midst of autumn. "Said I might," he replied, removing his hat. "Place looks nice." "Thank you, Mrs. Peterson and I spent all afternoon decorating." She glanced around at the gathered townsfolk. "Have you met many people in Sweetwater?" Isaac shook his head. "Don't come to town much except for supplies." "Then allow me to introduce you to some of my new acquaintances." Before he could object, Beatrice had taken his arm and was leading him toward a group of people. The next hour passed in a blur of introductions and small talk. Isaac met the town doctor, the banker and his wife, the blacksmith and various shopkeepers. Through it all, Beatrice remained by his side, smoothing over awkward moments with her easy conversation and genuine interest in everyone she spoke to. When the band struck up a lively tune, the center of the room cleared for dancing. Isaac watched as couples took to the floor, including Hollister and his plump wife. "Do you dance, Isaac?" Beatrice asked, her eyes bright in the lantern light. "Not in a long time," he admitted. "It's like riding a horse," she teased. "You never truly forget." Before he could formulate a response, they were interrupted by a young man in a store clerk's neat attire. "Miss Fletcher," the man said with a slight bow, "may I have the honor of this dance?" Isaac felt a strange tightening in his chest as Beatrice smiled at the clerk. "Thank you, Mr. Peterson." "That would be lovely." She gave Isaac an apologetic glance before being led to the dance floor. Isaac watched as she moved gracefully to the music, her green dress swirling around her ankles. The clerk held her with proper decorum, but his admiring gaze was unmistakable. Of course, Isaac thought, she'd have suitors. A beautiful, educated woman like Beatrice would have her choice of men, even in a frontier town like Sweetwater. The realization brought an unexpected surge of something, not jealousy, surely. He had no claim on her, nor did he want one. Yet as he watched her dance, first with the clerk and then with the young deputy sheriff, Isaac felt increasingly out of place. This world of social niceties and dancing belonged to people with different lives than his, people with futures and aspirations beyond the next cattle drive or winter season. When Beatrice was momentarily alone, refreshing herself with a cup of punch, Isaac approached to make his excuses. "I should be heading back," he said. "Early start tomorrow." Disappointment flickered across her face. "But the evening has barely begun. They haven't even served the supper yet." "Ranch work doesn't wait for socials," he said, more gruffly than intended. "I see," her voice cooled slightly. "Well, thank you for coming, Isaac." "It was good to see you again." He nodded, desperate to escape the conflicting emotions churning within him. "Good night, Beatrice." As he turned to leave, she called after him, "Isaac." He paused. The school is hosting a reading circle on Tuesday evenings. Adults from town who wish to discuss books and ideas. Her eyes held his. "We're starting with Emerson. You'd be welcome to join us." For a moment, Isaac was tempted. The thought of intellectual conversation, of seeing Beatrice's eyes light up as she discussed ideas, but then reality reasserted itself. "I don't think so," he said. "But thank you for the invitation." Outside in the cool night air, Isaac berated himself for coming at all. What had he expected? That a refined, educated woman from Boston would have any genuine interest in a cowboy with calloused hands and an 8th-grade education. Beatrice Fletcher was being kind, nothing more, and kindness, in Isaac's experience, often masked pity. As he rode back to the Triple R under a canopy of stars, Isaac reinforced the walls around his heart. The frontier was no place for foolish hopes or tender feelings. He'd learned that lesson through blood and loss, and he wouldn't forget it again. November brought colder weather and the beginning of winter preparations. At the Triple R, Isaac threw himself into work, volunteering for the most difficult and isolated tasks. He avoided town runs, sending his lists with other cowboys when supplies were needed. If the others noticed his increased solitude, they didn't comment on it. Men on the frontier respected the unspoken boundaries of their fellows. Only Wilson, with whom Isaac had developed something approaching friendship, dared to broach the subject one evening as they repaired tack in the barn. "Haven't seen you ride into town lately," Wilson observed, his fingers working a stubborn piece of leather. "Thought you might be sweet on that schoolteacher." Isaac's hands stilled momentarily. "Don't know what gave you that idea." "Maybe the fact you cleaned up like a Sunday preacher for that harvest social," Wilson grinned. "First time I've seen you wear that string tie since old man Rutherford's birthday dinner." "Was just being respectful," Isaac muttered. "Anyway, she's not interested in cowboys. Saw her dancing with half the respectable men in town." Wilson eyed him shrewdly. "So you are sweet on her." "Drop it, Wilson." To Isaac's relief, the other cowboy changed the subject, but the seed of discomfort had been planted. If Wilson had noticed his interest in Beatrice, others might have as well. The last thing Isaac wanted was to become the subject of bunkhouse speculation, or worse, town gossip that might reach Beatrice herself. The following week, Foreman Tucker approached Isaac after the morning assignments had been given out. "Young, need you to take the wagon into Sweetwater. We're getting low on winter provisions, and the weather man says there's a big storm coming end of the month." Isaac's stomach tightened. "Can't someone else go?" Tucker frowned. "Everyone else is busy with the north pasture fencing. Besides, you're the most reliable with the accounts." His eyes narrowed. "They're a problem." Pride wouldn't allow Isaac to admit his reluctance. "No problem, I'll go." The journey to Sweetwater was made more difficult by his churning thoughts. It had been nearly 3 weeks since the harvest social. Surely by now, Beatrice would be fully settled into town life, perhaps even being courted by the clerk or deputy. His absence would have been barely noticed, if at all. Yet as he drove the wagon down the main street, Isaac couldn't help scanning the boardwalks for a glimpse of honey-blonde hair. He completed his purchases with efficient haste, checking items off Tucker's list and arranging for them to be loaded onto the wagon. It was as he was settling the account at the general store that the bell above the door jingled, and Beatrice walked in. She wore a practical blue dress and coat, her cheeks pink from the cold air outside. When she saw him at the counter, she stopped short, surprise evident in her expression. "Isaac," she said, recovering quickly, "what a pleasant surprise." He nodded, acutely aware of Mr. Peterson, the shopkeeper, watching their interaction with interest. "Miss Fletcher." Her smile faltered at his formal address. "Are you well? I haven't seen you since the social." "Been busy at the ranch." Isaac handed Peterson the last of the money. "Winter preparations." "Of course." She adjusted the small basket on her arm. "And will you be in town long today?" "Just finishing up. Need to get back before dark." "I see." Something like disappointment crossed her features before she brightened again. "Well, it's good to see you, however briefly. Our reading circle has been quite successful, by the way. We've moved on from Emerson to Thoreau." Isaac felt a twinge of regret, glad to hear it. An awkward silence fell between them, filled only by the sounds of Peterson arranging items on his shelves with deliberate slowness, clearly eavesdropping. "Well," Beatrice finally said, "I won't keep you. Safe journey back to the Triple R." As she moved toward the dry goods section of the store, Isaac felt a surge of frustration with himself. Why was he being so cold? She'd done nothing to deserve it. "Beatrice," he called, causing her to turn, "how are you finding your first Montana winter?" Her face softened, challenging but invigorating. "The children are teaching me to ice skate on Willow Pond this weekend." "Be careful," he said. "Ice might not be thick enough yet." "The fathers have been testing it daily. They assure me it's safe." She tilted her head. "Perhaps you'd like to join us Saturday afternoon." Isaac should have declined immediately. Instead, he found himself saying, "Might do if I finish my work in time." Her smile returned, warming something in his chest that had been cold for too long. "I hope you can." As Isaac drove the loaded wagon back to the Triple R, he couldn't stop thinking about the invitation. Ice skating with the schoolchildren and their teacher, it was hardly an appropriate activity for a solitary cowboy. Yet the thought of seeing Beatrice again, of watching her laugh and interact with her students, held an appeal he couldn't deny. Saturday arrived clear and cold, perfect weather for ice skating. Isaac finished his morning chores in record time, then hesitated, torn between desire and caution. Finally, he approached Rutherford directly. "Sir, I was wondering if I might have the afternoon off." "Personal matter in town." Rutherford looked up from his ledgers, surprise evident in his weathered face. "You, personal matter." Isaac nodded, uncomfortable under the scrutiny. A slow smile spread across the rancher's face. "Wouldn't have anything to do with that pretty schoolteacher, would it?" Heat crept up Isaac's neck. "Just promised to help with a children's activity." Rutherford leaned back in his chair. 12 years you've worked for me, between here and the Wyoming spread. Can't recall you ever asking for personal time." "If it's a problem." "Didn't say that," Rutherford waved a hand. "Go on." "But I expect you back for evening feeding." "Yes, sir, thank you." Willow Pond lay just outside Sweetwater, a small, natural body of water fed by springs. When Isaac arrived, the scene before him was one of simple joy, children gliding across the ice, some with more skill than others, their laughter ringing in the crisp air. Parents and a few townspeople stood around the edges, some on the ice themselves, others warming their hands at small fires built on the shore. Isaac spotted Beatrice immediately. She was on the ice, holding the hands of a small girl who couldn't be more than 6, guiding her in gentle circles. She wore a blue woolen coat and matching hat, her honey blonde hair visible in the sunlight. Even from a distance, Isaac could see she was laughing. For a moment, he considered turning around and leaving before being noticed, but as if sensing his presence, Beatrice looked up. Her face brightened with recognition, and she waved, nearly losing her balance in the process. Isaac dismounted and approached the pond's edge, feeling conspicuous. Several parents nodded in greeting, while the children stared curiously at the cowboy in their midst. "You came," Beatrice said, carefully making her way to the edge of the pond, still holding the little girl's hand. "Mary, this is my friend Mr. Young from the Triple R Ranch." The child looked up at Isaac with wide eyes. "Do you ride horses all day?" Isaac couldn't help but smile at her directness. "Not all day, sometimes I have to fix fences." Mary seemed to find this answer satisfactory. "Miss Fletcher can't stay on the ice very good. Maybe you can help her." Beatrice laughed, a slight blush coloring her cheeks. "Mary, that's very forward." "But you said you wished Mr. Young would." "Mary," Beatrice interrupted hastily, "why don't you show your father how well you're skating now?" The child nodded and carefully made her way toward a bearded man, watching proudly from the shore. Beatrice turned back to Isaac, embarrassment evident in her expression. "Children," she said with a nervous laugh, so literal in their interpretations. Isaac found himself charmed by her discomfiture. "So you're having trouble staying upright." "Is it that obvious?" She gestured to her skates, simple blades attached to her boots. "We didn't have much occasion for ice skating in Boston, at least not in my neighborhood." "Can't say I've done much myself," Isaac admitted. "Mostly just sliding around in boots as a boy." "Then we can be novices together," she held out her hand, "unless you're afraid to risk your dignity." The challenge in her eyes was impossible to resist. Isaac quickly attached the spare pair of skates he'd borrowed from the ranch and stepped cautiously onto the ice. His first few strides were awkward, but he found his balance faster than expected. Years of riding horses had given him a good sense of balance and strong legs. Beatrice, however, was considerably less steady. When she took his arm, Isaac could feel her trembling with the effort of staying upright. "Perhaps this wasn't the best idea for a first meeting after weeks apart," she said ruefully as they made a slow circuit of the pond. "Why did you suggest ice skating if you can't skate?" he asked, genuinely curious. "The children were so excited to teach me." Her expression softened as she watched her students gliding around them. "I couldn't disappoint them," and she hesitated, then continued more quietly, "I hoped it might entice you to join us." Isaac nearly missed a stride. "Me, why?" Beatrice kept her eyes on the ice. "Because I've missed our conversations, brief as they were. You're different from the others in town." "Different how?" She looked up at him then, her green eyes serious. "You see me, Isaac. Not just the Boston schoolteacher or the unmarried woman, but me. Do you know how rare that is?" The sincerity in her voice struck him deeply. Before he could respond, her skate caught on a rough patch of ice, and she pitched forward with a small cry. Isaac's arm shot out instinctively, catching her around the waist and pulling her against him to prevent her fall. For a breathless moment, they stood frozen in that embrace, her face inches from his, her eyes wide with surprise. Isaac became acutely aware of her warmth, the soft curve of her waist beneath his arm, the cloud of her breath mingling with his in the cold air. "Thank you," she whispered. Isaac knew he should release her, step back to a proper distance. Instead, he found himself transfixed by the delicate flush spreading across her cheeks, and the way her lips parted slightly as she looked up at him. A child's shout broke the spell. Beatrice straightened and Isaac let his arm drop, though he kept a steadying hand on her elbow. "Perhaps we should return to solid ground," she suggested, her voice slightly unsteady. Isaac nodded, suddenly aware of the curious glances from parents around the pond. He guided her carefully to the shore, where they removed their skates in silence. "Would you care for some hot cider?" Beatrice asked, gesturing to where a large pot hung over one of the fires. Mrs. Wilson brought enough for everyone. The mention of the time reminded Isaac of his promise to return for evening feeding. "I should head back to the ranch," he said reluctantly. Disappointment flickered across her face. "Of course." "Ranch duties." An awkward silence fell between them. Isaac knew he should thank her for the invitation and leave. Instead, he found himself saying, "When is your next reading circle?" Beatrice's expression brightened immediately. "Tuesday evening at 7, we meet in the schoolhouse." Isaac nodded. "I'll be there." The surprise and pleasure that bloomed on her face made his heart skip. "Really, you'll come?" "Said I would, didn't I?" He managed a small smile. "Though I can't promise I'll have much to say about Thoreau. Just your presence would be welcome." She hesitated, then added softly, "Very welcome." As Isaac rode back to the Triple R, he found himself filled with a strange, buoyant feeling he hadn't experienced in years. The memory of Beatrice in his arms, her face close to his, replayed itself in his mind despite his attempts to focus on more practical matters. He knew he was treading dangerous ground. Getting involved with Sweetwater's schoolteacher could only lead to complications, for her reputation, for his position at the ranch, for the careful isolation he'd maintained since his brother's death. And yet, for the first time in 3 years, Isaac found himself looking forward to something beyond the next day's work. Tuesday evening found Isaac nervously approaching the schoolhouse, a copy of Walden borrowed from Rutherford's personal library tucked under his arm. Lights glowed from the windows, and as he climbed the steps, he could hear voices engaged in animated discussion inside. He hesitated at the door, suddenly unsure. What place did a cowboy with an 8th-grade education have in a literary discussion group led by a Boston-educated teacher? Perhaps this had been a mistake after all. Before he could retreat, the door opened, and Beatrice stood framed in the light. She wore a simple dress of deep blue, her honey-blonde hair arranged in a loose bun at the nape of her neck. At the sight of him, her face lit with such genuine pleasure that Isaac's doubts momentarily receded. "You came," she said, as if she hadn't quite believed he would. "Said I would," he replied, suddenly conscious of his clean but worn clothing and the hat clutched in his hands. She stepped aside to let him enter. "We're just getting started." The schoolroom had been rearranged, with desks pushed together to form a circle in the center. 6 people sat around it, the doctor and his wife, the banker's daughter, the telegraph operator, the deputy sheriff, and the young clerk from the general store. All looked up with varying degrees of surprise as Isaac entered. "Everyone," Beatrice said, "I believe you all know Mr. Young from the Triple R." A chorus of greetings followed, more welcoming than Isaac had expected. The doctor's wife patted the empty seat beside her. "Join us, Mr. Young. We were just discussing Thoreau's views on simplicity." The next 2 hours passed in a blur of conversation that ranged from philosophical to practical. Isaac remained mostly silent, listening intently as the others debated Thoreau's ideas. Occasionally, when the discussion turned to the practical aspects of living off the land, he would offer a brief comment, drawing on his years of frontier experience. Each time he spoke, Isaac was aware of Beatrice watching him, a small smile playing at her lips. She guided the discussion with a light touch, asking questions that drew out even the quietest members of the circle. As the evening concluded and the others gathered their things to leave, Beatrice approached Isaac. "Thank you for coming," she said quietly. "I hope you enjoyed it." "More than I expected," he admitted, "though I'm not sure I added much." On the contrary, your perspective on Thoreau's idealism versus the realities of frontier life was exactly what the discussion needed. Her eyes held his. Will you come again next week? We'll be discussing Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter. Isaac hesitated. I haven't read it. I have an extra copy you could borrow. She moved to her desk and retrieved a small, cloth-bound book. That is, if you'd like to. As Isaac accepted the book, their fingers brushed, sending an unexpected warmth up his arm. Thank you, I'll do my best to finish it. Beatrice walked him to the door, where they paused, suddenly awkward in the now empty schoolroom. Isaac, she said hesitantly, I'm glad you're here. The simple statement, spoken with such sincerity, broke something loose inside him. Before he could think better of it, Isaac reached out and gently touched her cheek. So am I. For a breathless moment, they stood suspended in possibility, her eyes wide and questioning. Then, from outside, came the sound of a throat clearing. The deputy sheriff stood at the bottom of the steps, clearly waiting to escort Beatrice home. Isaac stepped back immediately, reality crashing back. Good night, Miss Fletcher. Good night, Mr. Young, she replied formally, though her eyes said much more. As Isaac rode back to the Triple R, Hawthorne's novel secure in his saddlebag, he knew he was crossing a line he'd drawn for himself years ago. The frontier was no place for attachments. People left, died, or betrayed you. His brother's fate had proven that beyond doubt. Yet for the first time since Thomas's death, Isaac found himself wondering if there might be another way to live. If perhaps the walls he'd built around his heart were keeping out not just pain, but also the possibility of something worth the risk. The weeks leading up to Christmas saw a change in Isaac that did not go unnoticed at the Triple R. He attended the reading circle faithfully every Tuesday, borrowing books from Rutherford's library or Beatrice herself to prepare for each discussion. His contributions grew more frequent and confident, drawing on both his practical experience of frontier life and his surprisingly keen understanding of human nature. More significantly, he began visiting town on Saturdays, often finding reasons to stop by the schoolhouse or to cross paths with Beatrice on her errands. Their conversations, once awkward and halting, flowed more easily now, ranging from literature to their personal histories. Isaac learned that Beatrice was 21, the daughter of a Boston accountant and his wife, both now deceased. She had trained as a teacher and come west not just for the position, but to escape the stifling expectations of her late parents' social circle, where her outspoken nature and intellectual interests had made her an awkward fit. In turn, Isaac gradually shared pieces of his own past, his childhood in Ohio, his journey west with Thomas at 18, their years working ranches across Wyoming and Montana. He even, one crisp December afternoon as they walked along Willow Pond's frozen shore, told her about Thomas's death in a saloon brawl, a senseless fight over a card game that had left Isaac alone in the world. Is that why you keep people at a distance? Beatrice asked gently. Because of what happened to your brother. Isaac stared out at the ice-covered pond. Partly, learned young that caring about people just gives life more ways to hurt you. But it also gives life meaning, she countered, her gloved hand finding his. Without connections, what are we living for? He looked down at their joined hands. Been asking myself that lately. Her fingers tightened around his. And what answer have you found? Before Isaac could respond, voices approached, a family coming to skate on the pond. Beatrice released his hand reluctantly and the moment passed, but the question lingered in Isaac's mind long after they'd parted for the day. What was he living for? For years, the answer had been simple: survival. Working each day, earning his wages, moving from season to season without attachment or expectation. It had been a hollow existence, he now realized, but a safe one. Safety, however, no longer seemed as compelling as it once had. Not when he thought of Beatrice's smile, the warmth of her hand in his, the way her eyes lit up when discussing ideas she was passionate about. As Christmas approached, Sweetwater prepared for its annual Christmas Eve gathering at the town hall. Decorations appeared in shop windows, and excited chatter about the upcoming celebration filled the air whenever Isaac visited town. You will come to the Christmas celebration, won't you? Beatrice asked during one of their walks. The children have prepared a special recitation, and there will be music and food. Wasn't planning to, Isaac admitted. Christmas isn't much celebrated at the ranch. But it's a time for community, she pressed. For coming together in the darkest part of winter to find light and warmth. The hope in her voice was impossible to resist. "I'll try," he promised, though the thought of another town social made him uneasy. Their private conversations in the small reading circle were one thing. A large public gathering, where their growing closeness would be on display for the entire town, was another matter entirely. Yet as Christmas Eve approached, Isaac found himself wanting to see Beatrice in that setting, to watch her eyes sparkle in the light of Christmas candles, to perhaps even dance with her if the opportunity presented itself. The day before Christmas Eve, a package arrived for Isaac at the ranch, a rarity in itself. Inside, wrapped carefully in brown paper, was a hand-knitted scarf in deep blue wool, along with a note in Beatrice's elegant handwriting. "For cold nights on the range, with warmest regards, B.F." Isaac ran his fingers over the soft wool, marveling at the hours of work represented in each careful stitch. No one had made him a Christmas gift since his mother died 15 years ago. The thought that Beatrice had spent her precious free time creating something for him filled Isaac with a warmth that had nothing to do with the scarf itself. That evening he approached Rutherford with a request for Christmas Eve off, which was granted with a knowing smile. Then, for the first time in years, Isaac rode into Sweetwater not for supplies or reading circle, but for a more personal purpose, to find a suitable Christmas gift for Beatrice. The options in a frontier town were limited, especially for a cowboy's wages. Isaac visited the general store, examining the meager selection of items that might be considered gifts. Nothing seemed right until, in a glass case near the register, he spotted a small silver pendant on a delicate chain. The pendant was shaped like an open book, simple but elegant. "That's a new item," Peterson said, following his gaze. "Came in on the last shipment from Chicago. Meant to show it to Miss Fletcher, thought it might suit her." "How much?" Isaac asked, ignoring the implication in the shopkeeper's tone. Peterson named a sum that represented nearly half of Isaac's monthly wages. It was extravagant, foolish even. But as Isaac pictured Beatrice opening it, her green eyes widening with surprise, he knew he couldn't leave without it. "I'll take it," he said, counting out the money, "and I'll need it wrapped properly." Peterson raised an eyebrow but complied, placing the pendant in a small box and wrapping it carefully in festive paper. "For the schoolteacher, I presume." Isaac didn't dignify the question with a response, simply tucking the package inside his coat and leaving the store. As he mounted Silver for the ride back to the Triple R, snowflakes began to fall, large and gentle in the fading light. Christmas Eve arrived with a fresh blanket of snow covering the landscape. Isaac spent longer than usual preparing for the evening, bathing in the ranch's bathhouse, trimming his beard neatly, and putting on his best clothes, black trousers, a clean white shirt, and his only suit coat, seldom worn. Around his neck he wrapped Beatrice's blue scarf, its softness a constant reminder of her thoughtfulness. The Triple R's cook, an older man named Daniels, watched Isaac's preparations with amusement. "Been a while since I've seen you so spruced up, young. Must be some gathering in town." "Christmas celebration," Isaac replied, adjusting his string tie. "Thought I'd make an appearance." Daniels nodded sagely. "Wouldn't have anything to do with that schoolteacher everyone's talking about, would it?" Isaac stilled everyone. "Word gets around," Daniels shrugged. "Can't keep much secret in these parts, especially when a confirmed bachelor starts making regular trips to town." The reminder that his actions were being observed and discussed sent a flicker of unease through Isaac. He'd been so caught up in his growing feelings for Beatrice that he hadn't considered the implications for her reputation. A schoolteacher, especially one from the East, was expected to maintain impeccable standards of behavior. Being linked romantically with a cowboy, regardless of how respectable his position at the Triple R, could potentially undermine her standing in the community. These thoughts troubled Isaac as he rode toward Sweetwater. By the time the town came into view, its buildings glowing with lantern light against the snowy darkness, he had half convinced himself that the kindest thing would be to maintain a more distant, public relationship with Beatrice, for her own sake. The town hall was transformed for the Christmas celebration. Evergreen boughs decorated the walls, their fresh scent mingling with the aroma of spiced cider and baked goods. Candles glowed everywhere, casting a warm light over the gathered townsfolk, who were dressed in their holiday best. Isaac stood just inside the entrance, the small package in his pocket, suddenly feeling like a declaration he wasn't sure he had the right to make. His eyes scanned the crowd, inevitably seeking Beatrice. He found her near the front of the room, directing a group of children in what appeared to be final preparations for their recitation. She wore a dress of deep green velvet, simple but elegant, her honey blonde hair arranged in an intricate style with small sprigs of holly woven through it. Even from across the room, Isaac could see the animation in her face as she spoke to her students, her hands moving expressively. As if sensing his presence, Beatrice looked up, her eyes finding his unerringly across the crowded room. Her face brightened with a smile so genuine and unguarded that Isaac's concerns momentarily faded. She excused herself from the children and made her way toward him, weaving through the crowd with graceful determination. "You came," she said when she reached him, her eyes taking in his formal attire and the blue scarf, "and you're wearing my gift." "It's perfect," Isaac said, touching the soft wool. "Thank you." "It matches your eyes," she replied, then blushed slightly at her own forwardness. "I'm so glad you're here. The children's recitation will begin soon, and afterward there will be music and dancing." Before Isaac could respond, Hollister approached, his expression carefully neutral. "Miss Fletcher, the children are ready to begin." "Of course, Mr. Hollister." She turned back to Isaac. "Will you stay for the whole evening?" "Wouldn't miss it," he found himself saying, despite his earlier reservations. Her smile was radiant. "Find me after the recitation." Isaac nodded, watching as she returned to her students. Hollister lingered, his gaze assessing. "Young," he acknowledged. "Didn't expect to see you at our little town gathering." "Miss Fletcher invited me," Isaac replied evenly. "Did she now?" It wasn't a question. "You've been spending a good deal of time in town lately, I understand." Isaac met the older man's gaze directly. "Is there a problem with that, Mr. Hollister?" "Not a problem, precisely." Hollister adjusted his spectacles. "But as chairman of the town council, I have a responsibility to consider the welfare of our community. Miss Fletcher is an important part of that community now. Her reputation affects the school's reputation." The implication was clear. Isaac felt a surge of anger, but kept his voice level. "Miss Fletcher is a grown woman capable of choosing her own associations. And my intentions toward her are honorable." Hollister studied him for a moment. "I'm sure they are, but intentions aren't always enough in a place like Sweetwater. People talk young, and not everyone is as understanding as I am about a cowboy calling on our schoolteacher." Before Isaac could respond, a bell rang, signaling the start of the children's performance. Hollister nodded curtly and moved away, leaving Isaac with a renewed sense of unease. The children's recitation was charming, a combination of Christmas poems and carols, directed with obvious care by Beatrice. Isaac watched her more than the children, noting the pride in her expression as her students performed, the gentle encouragement she offered when one boy forgot his lines, the pure joy that radiated from her as she led them in a final carol. When the performance concluded to enthusiastic applause, the chairs were moved aside to create space for dancing. The small band struck up a lively tune, and couples began to fill the floor. Isaac made his way toward Beatrice, who was accepting congratulations from parents on the children's performance. She saw him approaching and excused herself, meeting him halfway. "What did you think?" she asked eagerly. "They did well," he said. "You've taught them a lot in a short time. They're eager learners," her eyes sparkled in the candlelight, "and now it's time for the adults to enjoy themselves. Would you care to dance?" The memory of their embrace on the ice flashed through Isaac's mind, along with Hollister's warning about reputation. "I'm not much of a dancer," he hedged. Something like disappointment crossed her face. "I understand, perhaps some cider then." They moved to the refreshment table, where Beatrice was immediately engaged in conversation by several mothers. Isaac stood slightly apart, observing the interactions. Everyone was unfailingly polite to Beatrice, even warm, but he noticed several curious glances directed his way. Hollister's words echoed in his mind. "People talk young." Was he being selfish, pursuing his feelings for Beatrice when it might compromise her position in the community? She loved her work, that much was obvious from the way she spoke about her students and the care she put into teaching them. What right did he have to potentially jeopardize that? Lost in these thoughts, Isaac didn't notice the young clerk approach Beatrice until they were already moving toward the dance floor together. He watched as Peterson placed a proper hand at Beatrice's waist, leading her into the dance with practiced steps. They made an attractive couple, both educated, respectable members of the community. The sight provoked an unexpected pain in Isaac's chest. This was how it should be, he told himself. Beatrice deserved someone who could enhance her standing in the community, not complicate it. Someone whose presence at her side would invite approving nods, not curious whispers. When the dance ended, Isaac had made his decision. He would wish Beatrice a Merry Christmas, give her the pendant in private, and then step back. Their friendship could continue through the reading circle, but he would cease his more personal attentions. It was the right thing to do, the honorable thing, even if the thought filled him with a hollow ache. He waited until she was momentarily alone before approaching. "Beatrice," he said quietly, "could I speak with you privately for a moment?" She looked up at him, something in his tone causing her smile to falter. "Of course. The cloakroom is quiet." They made their way to the small room off the main hall where coats and hats were stored. Once inside, with the door partially closed, Beatrice turned to him with concern in her eyes. "Is something wrong, Isaac?" He took a deep breath. "I've been thinking about us, about what people might be saying." Her expression became guarded. "What people are saying?" "About a cowboy spending time with the schoolteacher." He couldn't quite meet her eyes. "It might not be good for your position here." "My position," her voice had cooled noticeably. "And who, exactly, has expressed concern about my position?" "Hollister mentioned." "Mr. Hollister spoke to you about me." The temperature in her voice dropped further. "And what business is it of his whom I choose to spend time with?" Isaac looked up, surprised by her anger. "He's the town council chairman. He's concerned about the school's reputation." "The school's reputation is exemplary, as is my teaching." Her green eyes flashed. "Are you using Mr. Hollister's concern as an excuse, Isaac? Because if you've changed your feelings toward me, I would prefer honesty to this misplaced gallantry." "Changed my feelings?" Isaac shook his head, confused by the turn in conversation. "No, I'm trying to protect your standing in the community. By deciding for me what is best for my life." Beatrice stepped closer, her voice low and intense. "I did not leave Boston and travel 2,000 miles to escape one set of social constraints only to have new ones imposed on me, especially by someone I thought understood me." Isaac felt wrong-footed, the conversation veering far from what he'd intended. "Beatrice, I only meant—" "I know what you meant," she interrupted. "You meant to be noble, but true nobility would be respecting my ability to make my own choices, to weigh consequences for myself." Her voice softened slightly. "I know what people might say, Isaac. I've heard the whispers already. And I have decided they don't matter to me nearly as much as—" She stopped, looking away. "As much as what?" he asked, his heart suddenly pounding. She met his gaze again, vulnerability replacing anger in her eyes. "As much as what I feel when I'm with you." The simple declaration stole the breath from Isaac's lungs. Before he could respond, she continued, her words tumbling out in a rush of emotion. "When we're together discussing books or walking by the pond or just existing in the same space, I feel more alive than I ever have, more myself. You see me, Isaac, not the proper Boston lady or the frontier schoolteacher, but me. And I see you not just the cowboy or the hardened frontiersman, but the thoughtful, kind, intelligent man beneath those labels." She took a shaky breath. "If you don't feel the same, tell me now and I'll never speak of this again. But don't hide behind concern for my reputation when what you really fear is letting someone close enough to matter again." Her words struck with uncanny precision at the heart of Isaac's defenses. She had seen through his noble intentions to the fear beneath, the terror of caring deeply for someone who could be taken away, as Thomas had been. "I'm afraid," he admitted, the words painful in their honesty. "Not of what people might say, but of what happens if I let myself feel everything I could feel for you." Beatrice's expression softened. "Oh, Isaac, do you think I'm not afraid too? Loving anyone is an act of courage." The word loving hung in the air between them, neither quite ready to claim it directly, but both feeling its presence. Isaac reached into his pocket and withdrew the small package. "I got you something," he said, "for Christmas." Beatrice accepted it with surprise. "You didn't have to." "I wanted to." He watched as she carefully unwrapped the package, her fingers tracing the paper as if reluctant to tear it. When she opened the box and saw the silver book pendant, her eyes widened. "Isaac," she breathed, "it's beautiful." "Reminded me of you," he said simply, "of the way you've opened up the world of books to me again. Of how much I've learned from you." Beatrice lifted the necklace from its box. Will you help me put it on? Isaac took the delicate chain, his fingers brushing the warm skin of her neck as he fastened the clasp. The pendant nestled just below her throat, catching the light as she turned to face him again. How does it look? She asked softly. Perfect, he replied, his voice rough with emotion. Like it was made for you. She reached up, her fingers brushing his cheek. Thank you, not just for the gift, but for seeing me. The moment stretched between them, taut with possibility. From the main hall came the sounds of music and laughter, but in the small cloakroom, there was only the whisper of their breathing and the unspoken words in their eyes. Isaac leaned forward slowly, giving her every chance to turn away. Instead, Beatrice raised her face to his, her eyes fluttering closed as their lips met. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, as if testing fragile ice. Then, as Beatrice's arms slid around his neck, it deepened into something warm and certain. Isaac pulled her closer, one hand at the small of her back, the other cupping her cheek with a tenderness he'd thought lost to him. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Beatrice rested her forehead against his. I've been wanting to do that since the ice skating pond, she confessed. Isaac smiled, feeling lighter than he had in years. I've been wanting to do that since you took my coat in the snowstorm. The door to the cloakroom opened suddenly, admitting an elderly couple who stopped short at the sight of Isaac and Beatrice in their close embrace. The woman's eyebrows rose dramatically, while her husband harumphed in disapproval. Beatrice stepped back from Isaac but didn't release his hand. Merry Christmas, Mr. and Mrs. Davidson, she said with remarkable composure. Lovely celebration this evening, isn't it? Without waiting for response, she led Isaac past the astonished couple and back into the main hall. As they emerged, Isaac was acutely aware of the curious glances directed their way, the whispers behind hands, the knowing smiles. People are watching, he murmured. Let them, Beatrice replied, her chin lifted in gentle defiance. I'm finished with hiding my feelings to satisfy others' expectations. She squeezed his hand. Dance with me. In that moment, Isaac knew he'd crossed a line from which there was no returning. The walls he'd built around his heart since Thomas's death had been breached completely, leaving him vulnerable in ways he'd sworn never to be again. Yet as he led Beatrice onto the dance floor, he found he didn't regret it. For the first time in 3 years, Isaac Young was dancing, and as he held Beatrice Fletcher in his arms, moving to the music while the townsfolk of Sweetwater looked on, he realized what he was living for, not just survival, but the chance to feel alive again. To feel warm, the winter of 1872-73 proved to be one of the harshest in memory, with frequent blizzards and temperatures that dropped far below zero. January found the Triple R Ranch operating at minimal capacity, with the cowboys focused primarily on keeping the cattle alive and the horses fed. Isaac found his duties increased as several hands left for warmer territories, unwilling to endure Montana's brutal winter. Despite the weather and workload, he made the journey into Sweetwater whenever possible. Sometimes he could stay only briefly, warming himself at the schoolhouse stove while Beatrice marked papers or prepared lessons. Other times, when the weather granted a reprieve, they would walk through the snow-covered town, their breath clouding in the cold air as they talked about books, dreams, and the future. Their relationship had become common knowledge after the Christmas Eve dance. To Isaac's surprise, the reaction from the townspeople was mixed but generally accepting. There were disapproving glances from some of the more conservative elements, including Hollister and his wife, but others seemed almost relieved to see the serious schoolteacher and the solitary cowboy finding happiness together. The reading circle continued each Tuesday, though Isaac now sat beside Beatrice rather than across from her. Their hands would occasionally touch beneath the table as they discussed Dickens or Austen or Melville, sending warmth through Isaac that had nothing to do with the crackling fire in the schoolhouse stove. February brought Valentine's Day, a holiday Isaac had ignored for most of his adult life. This year, however, he found himself riding into Sweetwater with a small wooden box he'd carved during the long evenings in the bunkhouse. Inside was a pressed wildflower he'd preserved from the previous summer, one of the first Indian paintbrush blooms of the season, its vibrant red color still visible against the thin paper that protected it. It's beautiful, Beatrice said when he presented it to her after school had dismissed, but how did you preserve it so perfectly? My mother taught me, Isaac explained, slightly embarrassed. She kept a book of pressed flowers from every place my father's work took them. After she died, I started doing the same when Thomas and I came west, Silly habit for a cowboy, I suppose. Not silly at all, Beatrice said softly, touching the delicate bloom with gentle fingers. It's lovely to think of you carrying this piece of summer through the winter, like a promise that spring will return. She placed the box carefully on her desk and reached for a drawer. I have something for you as well. From the drawer she withdrew a small, leather-bound book. It's a collection of Whitman's poetry, she explained as she handed it to him. I thought you might enjoy his celebration of the American spirit and the beauty of the natural world. Isaac opened the cover to find an inscription in her elegant handwriting. To Isaac, who offered his coat to a cold stranger, not knowing he would warm her heart forever, with deepest affection, Beatrice. Thank you, he said, his voice rough with emotion. I'll treasure it. They walked together to the widow Cooper's house, where Beatrice had lived since her arrival in Sweetwater. The elderly woman had taken a liking to the young schoolteacher and had relaxed her usually strict rules about gentlemen callers, allowing Isaac to visit Beatrice in the small parlor as long as the door remained open. As they sat together on the worn settee, their conversation turned, as it increasingly did, toward the future. Spring will be here before we know it, Beatrice said, watching the snow fall gently outside the window. The children are already asking when they can have lessons outdoors again. The cattle drive to Cheyenne will start in late May, Isaac replied. I'll be gone nearly a month. Beatrice's hand found his. I'll miss you terribly. You could write to me, he suggested. I'll send letters when we reach towns along the way. I'd like that, she hesitated, then continued more tentatively. Have you given any thought to what comes after the cattle drive? Isaac knew what she was asking. Their relationship had deepened over the winter months, moving from friendship to something far more profound. They hadn't spoken the word love aloud yet, but it existed in every touch, every glance, every conversation that extended until the widow Cooper gently reminded them of the hour. I have, he admitted. Been thinking about it a lot, actually. Beatrice waited, her green eyes patient but expectant. The thing is, Isaac continued, finding the words difficult despite having rehearsed them in his mind countless times, I've been a cowboy for 8 years. It's what I know, what I'm good at, but it's not a life that's, he paused, searching for the right phrase, compatible with certain other things I want. What things? Beatrice prompted softly. Isaac met her gaze directly. A home, stability. A family someday, he swallowed hard, a wife. The last word hung in the air between them, laden with meaning. Beatrice's eyes widened slightly, a flush coloring her cheeks. Are you saying? Not yet, Isaac interrupted gently. Not until I have something more to offer than a cowboy's wages and a bunk in a shared house. He squeezed her hand. But I've been talking with Rutherford about taking over as foreman when Tucker retires this summer. It would mean a house of my own on the ranch property, better pay, more stability. Beatrice's face brightened. Isaac, that's wonderful. Do you think he'll choose you? He's considering it. Said he appreciates how I've settled down this past year. Isaac smiled wryly. Think he meant becoming less of a loner, more part of the ranch community. That's your influence. I doubt that, she demurred. You were always capable of connection. You just needed a reason to try again. The truth of her words struck Isaac deeply. Before Beatrice, he'd existed rather than lived, going through the motions of survival without any real joy or purpose beyond the next day's work. She had awakened something in him that he'd thought dead, the capacity to care, to plan, to hope. You're right, he acknowledged. You gave me that reason. Before Beatrice could respond, the widow Cooper appeared in the doorway, her expression apologetic but firm. It's getting late, Miss Fletcher, and you have school tomorrow. Of course, Mrs. Cooper. Beatrice rose, still holding Isaac's hand, just a moment to say good night. The older woman nodded and withdrew, though Isaac knew she wouldn't go far. The widow's hearing was remarkably acute for a woman of her years, particularly when it came to parlor conversations. I should go, Isaac said, standing reluctantly. It's a long ride back to the ranch. Be careful, Beatrice said, her concern evident. The temperature is dropping. I've got my coat, he reassured her. And your scarf. She smiled at that, reaching up to adjust the blue wool around his neck. I made it to keep you warm, after all. It does, Isaac leaned down to kiss her gently. but not nearly as warm as thinking about you on the ride home. Beatrice's eyes softened. Isaac Young, beneath that reserved exterior, beats the heart of a poet. Don't tell the other cowboys, he teased. They'd never let me hear the end of it. With a final kiss and a promise to return when his duties allowed, Isaac left the widow Cooper's house and mounted Silver for the ride back to the Triple R. The night was clear and cold, stars brilliant in the black sky above. As he rode, Isaac found himself planning, calculating, dreaming of possibilities that had seemed unimaginable just months before. If he secured the foreman position, he would have a proper home to offer Beatrice, a small but sturdy house on the ranch property, close enough to town for her to continue teaching if she wished, and if not, well, there were other options. Homesteading land was still available, or perhaps a small business in town, though he had few skills beyond ranching. One thing was certain: Isaac Young was no longer content merely to survive. He wanted to build something lasting, something worthy of the future he increasingly dared to imagine with Beatrice Fletcher at his side. Spring came late to Montana that year, but when it arrived, it did so with sudden, explosive beauty. The snow melted almost overnight, transforming the landscape from white to vibrant green. Wildflowers carpeted the plains, and the cattle grew fat on the lush new grass. For Isaac, spring brought both opportunity and separation. Rutherford confirmed his promotion to foreman, to begin after the Cheyenne drive. This news Isaac shared with Beatrice on a Sunday afternoon as they picnicked by Willow Pond, now free of ice and reflecting the blue sky above. "It's really happening," she said, her face alight with happiness. "Your own house, a position of responsibility. I'm so proud of you, Isaac." "It's because of you," he replied, taking her hand. "You made me want more than just getting by." Her fingers intertwined with his. "You made me brave enough to create the life I wanted, not the one others expected. I'd say we've been good for each other." "Better than good." Isaac reached into his pocket with his free hand. "Which is why I wanted to give you this before I leave for the cattle drive." He withdrew a simple gold band, set with a small but perfect emerald. Beatrice's breath caught as she looked from the ring to Isaac's face. "It's not fancy," he said nervously, "and I know the timing isn't ideal with me leaving for a month, but I couldn't go without." "Yes," Beatrice interrupted, her eyes shining. "The answer is yes, Isaac." He blinked, momentarily confused. "I haven't asked the question yet." She laughed, the sound pure joy. "Then ask me properly so I can say yes again." Isaac slid from the blanket to one knee beside her, still holding her hand. The wildflowers around them swayed in the gentle spring breeze, and somewhere nearby a meadowlark sang its clear, sweet song. "Beatrice Fletcher," he said, his voice steady despite the hammering of his heart, "I love you more than I thought it was possible to love anyone. You brought warmth and meaning back into my life when I thought those things were lost to me forever. Will you marry me?" "Yes," she said again, her voice breaking on the word. "With all my heart, yes." As Isaac slipped the ring onto her finger, Beatrice pulled him close for a kiss that promised a lifetime of warmth to come. The cattle drive departed 3 days later, with Isaac carrying Beatrice's promise and the memory of her kisses to sustain him through the long journey. The month of separation was difficult for both, eased somewhat by letters exchanged whenever the drive passed through towns with postal service. In Beatrice's last letter, sent to Cheyenne to await Isaac's arrival, she wrote of her plans for their wedding upon his return. The town had received the news of their engagement with general approval, and even Hollister had offered congratulations, albeit somewhat stiffly. "The widow Cooper has insisted on hosting a proper reception in her garden," Beatrice wrote, "and my students are beside themselves with excitement. Little Mary has appointed herself flower girl without consultation, and I haven't the heart to disappoint her. Return safely to me, my love. I count the days until we begin our life together." Isaac read and reread the letter during the final days of the drive, carrying it in his breast pocket alongside the portrait Beatrice had given him, a small photographic likeness in a protective case that he looked at each night before sleep. The return journey to Montana seemed interminable, though in reality it took less than 2 weeks. When at last the familiar landscape of the Triple R came into view, Isaac felt a surge of emotion that surprised him with its intensity. This was home now, in a way no place had been since his childhood in Ohio. Rutherford was waiting when the drovers rode in, tired but successful, after delivering the cattle to the railhead in Cheyenne. Welcome back, Foreman, the rancher said, shaking Isaac's hand. Drive went well. No major problems, Isaac reported. Lost only 12 head, all accounted for in my ledger. Good man. Rutherford nodded approvingly. Your house is ready. Had the men fixed the roof and put in a new stove while you were gone. Thought your bride might appreciate it. Isaac felt a rush of gratitude. Thank you, sir. That's very generous. Not generosity, just good business. Rutherford's eyes twinkled. Happy foremen run better ranches. Now go get cleaned up and see that schoolteacher of yours. She's been riding out here twice a week checking on the house preparations. After a much-needed bath and change into clean clothes, Isaac rode into Sweetwater. The town seemed different somehow, more vibrant and welcoming than it had before. Or perhaps, he reflected, it was he who had changed. The schoolhouse door stood open to the warm June afternoon, and as Isaac dismounted, he could hear Beatrice's voice within, reading aloud to what sounded like a single student. He paused at the threshold, simply watching for a moment. She sat at her desk, a book open before her, while a small boy, one of the younger students, perhaps 6 or 7, stood beside her, following the words with his finger as she read. The sunlight streaming through the windows caught the gold in her honey-blonde hair and glinted off the emerald ring on her left hand. The sight filled Isaac with such overwhelming love that for a moment he couldn't speak. This was to be his life, coming home to this remarkable woman, building a future together, perhaps someday watching her teach their own children to read just as she was teaching this boy. The floorboard creaked beneath his boot and Beatrice looked up, her face transformed with joy as she saw him, and she rose so quickly that her chair nearly toppled. Isaac. The boy turned too, his eyes wide at the interruption. Is that your cowboy, Miss Fletcher? Beatrice laughed, a sound of pure happiness. Yes, Tommy, this is Mr. Young, my fiancé. The one who gave you his coat in the snowstorm, Tommy asked, clearly familiar with the story. The very same, Beatrice confirmed, her eyes never leaving Isaac's face. Tommy, I think we'll finish our reading tomorrow. Please tell your mother I said hello. The boy nodded, gathering his slate and books. He paused as he passed Isaac, looking up with solemn eyes. Miss Fletcher is the best teacher ever. You better be nice to her. Isaac fought back a smile. I promise I will be, Tommy. Satisfied, the boy left, his footsteps echoing on the wooden steps outside. For a moment, Isaac and Beatrice simply looked at each other across the schoolroom. Then, as if drawn by an irresistible force, they moved together, meeting in the center of the room in an embrace that spoke of long separation and joyful reunion. You're back, Beatrice whispered against his shoulder. Finally. Isaac held her close, breathing in the lavender scent of her hair. I missed you every day. And I you, she pulled back slightly to look up at him, her hands framing his face. You're thinner and more tanned. The trail does that, he said, then smiled, but I'm home now. Home, the word had never held such meaning for Isaac as it did in that moment, standing in the schoolhouse with Beatrice in his arms. Home wasn't a place, he realized, but a feeling, a sense of belonging, of being truly seen and valued. The house at the ranch is ready, he told her. Rutherford had it fixed up while I was gone. Said you've been out there checking on the preparations. Beatrice nodded, a slight blush coloring her cheeks. I hope you don't mind. I wanted to make sure it would be comfortable for us. It's going to be our home, Isaac said, kissing her forehead. I want you to make it yours in every way. She smiled up at him. 3 more weeks until the wedding. Do you think you can wait that long? I've waited my whole life for you, Isaac replied, surprising himself with the simple truth of the words. 3 more weeks is nothing. The wedding of Isaac Young and Beatrice Fletcher took place on a perfect July morning in the garden of the widow Cooper's house. The entire town of Sweetwater turned out for the occasion, along with Rutherford and the men from the Triple R. Beatrice wore a gown of ivory silk ordered specially from Chicago, with lace at the collar and cuffs that had belonged to her mother. Isaac, at Wilson's insistence, wore a new suit purchased for the occasion with his blue scarf, Beatrice's first gift to him, fashioned into a cravat. As they exchanged vows beneath an arch of summer roses, Isaac marveled at the journey that had brought them to this moment. From a chance encounter on a snowy night to a lifetime commitment beneath a summer sky, it seemed both miraculous and inevitable. I now pronounce you man and wife, the minister declared. You may kiss your bride. As Isaac leaned down to kiss Beatrice, now his wife, cheers erupted from the assembled guests. He felt her smile against his lips, and when they parted, the joy in her green eyes reflected his own. "Mrs. Young," he whispered, testing the sound of her new name. "Mr. Young," she replied, her voice warm with promise. "Shall we begin our adventure?" Hand in hand, they moved through the crowd, accepting congratulations and well wishes from friends and neighbors who had witnessed their courtship blossom over the past 8 months. Even Hollister seemed genuinely pleased, shaking Isaac's hand firmly and telling Beatrice she had chosen well. The celebration continued well into the afternoon, with food and music and dancing in the widow's garden. As the sun began its descent toward the western hills, Isaac and Beatrice took their leave, climbing into the wagon that would carry them to their new home at the Triple R. The house was small but well built, set apart from the main ranch buildings with a view of the mountains to the west. Inside, Beatrice had already added feminine touches: curtains at the windows, a colorful quilt on the bed, books arranged on shelves Isaac had built during the spring. As evening fell, they stood together on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and reds. Beatrice leaned against Isaac's side, his arm around her waist, her head on his shoulder. "Happy?" he asked, though he could feel the answer and the contentment radiating from her. "Completely," she replied. "And you?" Isaac considered the question, thinking back to that snowy night in Sweetwater when he'd offered his coat to a cold stranger. How could he have known then that simple act of kindness would lead to this, to love, to partnership, to a future brighter than any he'd dared imagine? "I never thought I'd feel this way again," he admitted. "After Thomas died, I convinced myself the frontier was no place for connection or vulnerability, that caring about people just gave life more ways to hurt you." Beatrice looked up at him, her eyes soft in the fading light. "And now?" "Now I know better," Isaac drew her closer. "Loving you hasn't made me weaker, it's made me stronger, more complete. You were right that day by the pond, connections give life meaning." She reached up to touch his face gently. "We've both found what we were looking for, I think. Not just love, but understanding. A person who sees us for who we truly are." As darkness fell around them, stars appearing one by one in the vast Montana sky, Isaac Young held his wife close against the growing chill. No longer afraid of attachment or loss, no longer convinced that isolation was the price of survival on the frontier. "Come inside," he said softly. "It's getting cold." Beatrice smiled up at him, her eyes reflecting the first evening stars. "With you beside me, I'll never be cold again." Hand in hand, they entered their home, closing the door on the wilderness outside. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new joys, the beginning of a life built together day by day. But for tonight, in the warmth of their embrace, the past with all its sorrows faded away, leaving only the present moment and the promise of all the tomorrows to come. For Isaac Young, who had once offered his coat to a cold stranger, had found a truth he'd long forgotten, that even on the harsh frontier, love could flourish. And in that love, he had found not just warmth, but home.